Hi, my name is Barry Williams. I'm a software consultant at BMC supporting MainView. Today we'd like to talk about how you can set up what we're calling a self-service Db2 trace. We had a customer that requested this. They had an end user, some Db2 developers that wanted to be able to start up the Db2 trace, but they didn't want to have to actually log on to the mainframe and log into MainView to start the trace. And furthermore, they wanted the output of the trace to automatically be sent to them. So what we developed was where they could, from their desktop, they could kick off a Db2 SQL, and that would trigger the trace. So there's several pieces to this. The first piece is where we have an alarm that looks for what we're calling the trigger thread. And once we see that Db2 query, the alarm will fire. And then we have some automation on top of the alarm that once we see the alarm, then we have a auto operator rule that comes in and starts up the Db2 trace. At the same time, we set up an automatic purge and an FTP. So there's another rule that will come in 10 minutes later and purge the trace and then automatically submit a job to FTP the results to the requester. So there's a lot of features built into it that make sure that they can't start up duplicate traces, and you can only have one per end user. So the first piece of this is the alarm itself. So here you can see in Alarm Manager we have an alarm called Db2 Trace. So let's just go into that quickly and take a look at how this was set up. So in this case, we wrote the alarm so that it would trigger off a specific user ID and plan name. Of course, for demo purposes in this case, I'm just using BMC Tep2, which is one of our standard demo queries. And here you can see that we're triggering on a particular auth ID. So I was using the filter on the first panel to set the plan name. And then here on the second panel of the dialog, we are filtering based on user ID. So here you can see in the alarm message itself, we're passing several pieces of information. So the first thing we do, of course, is pass the Db2 subsystem ID. We pass the correlation ID and the auth ID. So let me cancel out of this. So the second piece of this is the actual automation rule itself. So here you can see we have a rule set called rule trace, and there are two rules in this rule set. So the first rule is the Db2 trace, and this is an alarm type rule, so that's going to fire when the alarm is true. So let's just take a look inside this rule. So here you can see we tell it to fire when that particular alarm ID is seen by auto operator. Here we set up a variable. The intent of this variable is to make sure that we will not start up a trace if one is already running. For this particular user ID, so we had the variable called trace active, and word 4 is the actual auth ID that was passed in the alarm message itself. So this way we set up a variable for each particular user to make sure that the trace is not currently running. The next thing we do is call an exec, Db2 TRC01, and then we pass the Db2 subsystem ID, the correlation ID, the auth ID, as well as the date and time. We also kick off a journal message. And this journal message, the intent of the journal message is to come in 10 minutes later and set up the purge of the trace. And we pass it the same information that we passed the first exec. So here we're doing a delay. In this case, for demo purposes, I set it to 1 minute and 6 seconds. So the trace is going to run for 1 minute. And then 6 seconds later, we'll come in and set up the purge for the trace. But in real life, at the customer that we developed this for, we had the trace run for 10 minutes. And then we came in 11 minutes later and purge the trace and set the results. So press enter, get to the next panel. And here, after the rule fires, then we set that variable to a value of yes to let you know that a trace is currently running. So this is kind of like a flip-flop variable. When we first come in and the rule first fires, we check to make sure that its value is not yes. And then once the rule fires, we come in and we set the value to yes. So that way we can guarantee that we will only fire one trace at a time for a particular user. Okay, so let's get out of that. So here's the rule that comes in this case 66 seconds later. And this is a journal message rule. So once we write out that journal message 66 seconds after the trace is started, then this particular rule will fire. And we take a look at this rule. You see that it's firing based on a particular journal message ID. And then we come in and make sure that the trace was actually running before we attempt to purge it. And that will actually prevent us from trying to purge something that doesn't exist. So not only does that variable control the fact that we're only going to start one trace at a time, but it also makes sure that we don't get out of sync and try to purge something that may not be running. So here you can see once this rule fires that we kick off an exec called Db2 TRG01, and we pass it the same information that we passed to the trace exec. And then, of course, we come in and we set that variable to no, indicating that we purged the trace and it's no longer active. So let's take a look at the actual execs that these rules call. I'm going to swap over to that. So I come in here to our proc lib. Okay, Db2 TRC. And here's the rex exec that the rule calls. So here's just some comments up front that kind of explains how you can set options for the trace. I'm going to scroll down, and you can see we come in and we parse the information that was passed from the rule, the Db2 subsystem ID, correlation ID, the auth ID, the date and time. These next four rows build a dataset name for the trace. So we're basically using a series of substrings and concatenations to build a dataset that will hold the output of the trace. So we set the high-level qualifier, and then we put in the subsystem ID, the auth ID, and the date and the time. So here, this is the IMF exec, which is an API into MainView. It allows us to actually issue a command to MainView for Db2 to start up a trace. And in this case, we're passing it a specific auth ID and plan name. And this way, we're only going to trace for a particular user. We also set the subsystem ID, of course. This stop count is the duration of the trace. So for demo purposes, I set it to 1 minute. But in real life, you could set that to any value you want. In the case of our customer, they wanted the trace to run for 10 minutes. Likewise, if we take a look at the purge exec, scroll up, come into the exec that's used to do the purge. It's very similar logic. So we come in, we parse the information that was passed to the exec, and then we build the same dataset name that we're going to purge by auth ID, but we also want to make sure that we're pointing to the correct dataset when we try to FTP the results. So here, we scroll down to here, you see that the same IMF exec API into MainView, where we're telling it to purge a particular trace for a specific auth ID and a particular Db2 subsystem. Then these next lines of code is what we use to actually submit the FTP. In our case, just for demo purposes, I'm using a print utility that takes the trace output and prints it into a data set. but for a particular customer, they replaced this with a job that would FTP the results to a particular user. And as you can see, we were parsing that dataset name so that we can point the utility to the proper dataset that it should use. So right here, you can see we're setting the input to the utility to the DSN that we built. And then if we scroll down, you can see this is really just building the JCL. Then at the very bottom here, it's another command that we use to actually submit the job to the internal reader. All right, so we've seen the alarm, we saw the two rules, and the tool is X. So let's actually take a look and try to make this thing work. So the next piece of the puzzle is to actually kick off a thread. So I have a demo query in my JCL dataset where I can submit a query. And if I swap over back to the alarms, you can see right now that they've only fired one time. So I actually tested that this morning. So notice that the fire count is 1 for each rule. So I'll swap in here. I'm going to submit this query. This is a long-running query. So now if I go into MainView for DB2, I can see here is my query that's going to cause that alarm to fire. So you can see the plan name is the same that I set in the alarm, and the auth ID is my user ID. If I actually come in and go to the Alarm Manager, I can see that I have this alarm active, of course, but now I'm going to type in alarms to see if it actually fired. So you can see right here that that alarm did fire. So now that this alarm fired, then of course the rule should have picked that up. If I go take a look at my rules, you can see that the Db2 Trace rule did fire an additional time, indicating that it saw the alarm come in. So now if I go back to MainView for Db2, and if I do a current trace, then you can see that we kicked off this trace. This is the self-service Db2 Trace. You can see that it was started at 12:48 and 3 seconds. So when this timestamp up here hits 12:49 and 3 seconds, then that trace should go away, which it did. Hold on. So if I press enter here, you can see that trace has now been purged. In fact, if I go over to the historical trace view and scroll down, then I should see that trace that we purged. Because we wrote it to a data set, we see that it maintains historically. If I scroll to the right, then you can see the data set name that we parsed in the exec, where we put in the high level and the auth ID and the date and timestamp. Now at this point, that means that the Db2 purge rule also fired. So if I go back to my rules, you can see that the purge came in 60 seconds later and did the purge. It also submitted that job. And that takes the trace and writes it to a data set. So now, if I come out, if I go out to SDSF, so give me a minute here, I'm going to bounce out here. And if I go into SDSF, oops, one more time, and I look at my output queue, then here's my job that was submitted by the Db2 purge exec. If I take a look, I can see it did the print. You can see this ran at 12:49. So now if I go out to my trace output data set, which is here, Db2 Trace, that's where I'm writing the output of the trace. And here's where I picked up the trace, and I printed the output into a sequential data set. And you can see that this is the trace that I kicked off at 12:48. It started on December 23rd. So this is actually in place at the customer site, so now their developers can start up a trace when they want to test some new code. So they just type in a specific query that in turn causes the trace to be started for 10 minutes on their particular auth ID. And then after that, anything that they execute in that particular DB2 subsystem will be traced for their auth ID. And then 10 minutes later, that output will be automatically FTP'd to them. That's what we call the self-service DB2 trace. Thank you for your time. If you have any questions, again, my name is Barry Williams, and feel free to reach out to me.